Today I'll show you step by step how I tattoo this bird. I'll give you a detailed insight into what I'm doing using a macro lens, and I provided the stencil and design in the video description so you can recreate it on practice skin. First, I shave the area, then disinfect it and apply a thin layer of stencil stuff. Position the stencil, press it on, and let it dry for 15 minutes. This is my Greywash. For the lines, I use a 3-round liner needle and set it to extend about 4 millimeters out of the cartridge. I'm working with 8 volts and a 4.2 millimeter stroke. I'll also show you the reference design, so you can always see exactly what I'm doing. If you're wondering which shades of gray I'm using, I'll explain that in a moment. Before you start, I recommend watching the whole video once, as it will change your approach. Now I secure the stencil with light gray and dark gray lines. I'm deliberately using a very fine needle here to avoid creating thick solid lines. As in a realistic design, thick lines should be used sparingly. The more details we sketch out with gray lines, the better the tattoo will turn out in the end. It would also be possible to outline everything in light gray, but because I'm trying to work efficiently, I'm using a dark gray tone directly for areas that will be darker later. This makes it easier to work on the edges with a larger needle later on. I'm trying to work with a system here that can be applied to many different designs, so it's about understanding the process. I leave the mole free so it can still be examined by a doctor. Moles are pigment spots on the skin, which can be indicators of skin changes or diseases such as skin cancer. If you tattoo over a mole, it might be difficult or impossible to detect changes, so always leave them free. Here, I have marked in red the lines I tattooed with dark gray. The remaining ones are in light gray. Now, I'm using a 7-round liner needle, and the machine settings remain the same. Since the 7-round liner is perfect for filling in small areas, I'm now tattooing the dark spots around the eye. It's important to leave the highlight in the eye free. Otherwise, in this step, I'm trying to outline all the areas that will be filled in later. This has the advantage that I can fill everything later with a larger needle without any problems. In this step, it's very important not to make lines, but to try to create the natural structure of the small feathers with small, circular, and zigzag movements. Even though this area in the reference at the top left looks very dark, highlights are visible. So, don't try to create a solid black area here. Only by considering these small details will it look like a realistic image in the end. You can already see that I'm reducing a lot of pressure by working with a system. Even though I've been doing this for many years, this approach gives me the confidence with each new project to avoid making mistakes or rushing and missing details. I don't show it every time, but before I tattoo, I always apply a thin layer of Vaseline to make wiping away excess ink easier. Also, Vaseline soothes the skin. Here, at the tips of the wings, I work inwards to create a sharp edge on the outside and a gradient on the inside. Right now, it looks fresh and black, but it's actually the darkest gray shade, and once healed, it will look lighter. I'm doing this for all the dark spots on the wings, but the principle remains the same, only that the dark areas get thinner as they go down. In this image, you can see that I have only tattooed the areas suitable for the 7-round liner. Sure, I could have filled in larger areas with this needle, but we'll use a needle that fits better for that. This way, not only am I faster, but it's also more comfortable for the client, because using a small needle would take much longer than using a larger one. That's why I always try to use the right tool. For packing, I use a 9-round shader needle. I extend it about 3 millimeters from the cartridge, use 8 volts, and work with a 3.6 millimeter stroke. Using small circular motions, I can now fill in the areas, and since I've done such a great job with a small needle earlier, this step is very easy and fun, especially as you see the progress. Just as a reminder, the area looks black but has many small details, so I avoid creating a solid black space. Especially when working on real skin, as you can see perfectly in this shot, it's super important to stretch the skin. Only this way can you work precisely and accurately. The better the skin is stretched, the better the color will go in. We've now reached this intermediate result. I'll keep showing you these images so you can catch up at your own pace if you want to recreate it. I believe this is the clearest way to explain it. For the shading, I use a 9 Magnum soft edge needle and extend it about 2 millimeters from the cartridge. I work with 8 volts and a 3.3 millimeter stroke. Here, I deliberately hold the needle sideways to create a texture. If you look closely at the reference, there isn't a solid shading but rather a very fine feather texture, and that's exactly what we want to replicate on the skin. Right after tattooing, the skin is always a bit irritated and redder, but this usually subsides within a few minutes. You can pay attention to how red the shading looks now, and later notice how the redness fades. I'm working with the Magnum needle right up to the edge. If that seems too difficult, you can simply use a thinner needle for that. In the end, what matters is the final result, not how long it took. What's important is to work cleanly, and with time and practice, you'll get faster. It would be way too complicated to show you exactly which shade of gray I dipped my needle into during every step. To help you understand how to proceed, I can only recommend keeping the reference close by and laying it as close to the tattoo as possible. This way, you can easily check the reference to see which shade of gray you need. Learning to feel for the right shade of gray is essential, and only once you understand that can you work properly. Since this part of the wing is supposed to be very dark, I'm shading the entire area with a very dark gray. The cool part is that we can still see the feathers, and because we've already worked the darker areas beforehand, it's now super easy to create this natural texture. For these fine details like here, you could also use a thin needle, but I think it works beautifully by using the edge of the Magnum needle. We've already done the prep work along the edges, so now we can just blend these dark areas easily. Super easy, and that's all because we're working with a system. Here, it's important to really make the dark areas dark. This is crucial for contrast. Even though the individual feathers on the wing look very similar, they are still slightly different, and that's exactly what I try to capture. One of the biggest problems I see with beginner tattoo artists is how they hold the tattoo machine. Many instinctively grip it like a ballpoint pen and try to write with it, but it doesn't work that way. You have to hold the machine in a position that initially feels unnatural. This requires a completely new system to work with, and you need to break some habits, like writing with a pen. If you were to simply hold the machine like a pen and start tattooing, probably 50% of your lines wouldn't be correct. Of course, you might see me sometimes hold the machine sideways, but I know the exact angle to keep it looking good. Beginners often don't. That's why it's extremely important to master the basics. A tip I can give to every beginner is, pull the lines evenly and consistently. Many make the mistake of starting the line slowly and then getting faster because they can't see the line anymore due to the excess ink on the skin. However, the most important thing is to keep the speed consistent. Consistency is the key to success here. Now it gets a bit more complicated. If, for example, I use a 7-round liner needle and pull a line slowly, the result will look different than if I use the same needle and pull the line quickly. The reason for this is that with a quickly drawn line, fewer ink pigments penetrate the skin, making the line appear thinner. You can even work with different shades of gray to simulate varying line thicknesses. A lighter shade of gray often looks like a thinner line compared to deep black. The message behind this is that a 7 or 9 round liner needle is still a thin needle, but beginners often think of them as thick needles. I hope you understand what I mean by that. It's extremely important to choose the right needle size. With a needle that's too thin, it's hard to create a thick line, and with a thicker needle, it's often easier to hit the right depth in the skin. Many beginners I know often use small needles, which unnecessarily makes their work harder. For example, if you need to shade a large area evenly, you shouldn't use a needle that's too small. I often see beginners thinking that a 9 Magnum is big enough, but in many cases, it's actually too small. Instead, it's better to use a 23 Magnum for such work. It makes the job much easier. If the design were a bit bigger, I would immediately switch to a larger needle. It's also important to understand how needles work and what effects they have. If you only switch from a 7 liner to a 9 liner, the difference is barely noticeable. You need to make much bigger jumps to see visible differences. For example, you should switch from a 3 liner to a 7 liner or a 9 liner to see a real change. While I was explaining my perspective to you, we have almost finished the 2 wings, and I specifically left the mole uncovered. The lower part of the design is very light in the reference image, but you can still see slight shading in the feather structure. It's important that when you work on this area, you do so very carefully because mistakes are immediately noticeable on lighter areas. Here, you can see perfectly how cautiously I work to capture all the details while avoiding mistakes. Take your time with this, and in the end, you'll see that it pays off. A mistake I frequently see with beginners is that they don't extend the needle far enough out of the cartridge. As a result, they have to go over the same spot multiple times. And in the end, the skin is often so damaged that scars form or the details are no longer visible. While scars can also form from tattooing too deeply, the most common reason for scarring is repeatedly going over the same spot. So always make sure to extend the needle far enough from the cartridge to work precisely. I'll show you a close-up of the rear feathers where you can clearly see how deep I am tattooing. It doesn't look very deep, but the ink is perfectly placed in the skin because I'm stretching it well. Otherwise, the principle is the same as with the wings above. Now, I switch back to a 7-round liner needle to touch up the areas I couldn't reach with the Magnum needle. I use the white highlights sparingly, but they are still very important for the final result. Highlights are absolutely essential for the eye, for example. Many beginners make the mistake of tattooing white ink, only to have it mix with blood, making it look like skin tone or something similar, so it's no longer visible that they've already tattooed white on that spot. Then they go over the same spot again, causing skin irritation. So, as a beginner, it's best to do 1 pass of white, take a 10-minute break until the redness subsides, and if another pass is still necessary, go ahead. This is what the final result looks like. If you want to support me, I'd be very happy if you like the video and subscribe to my channel. If you're interested in how I tattoo a realistic bee on real skin and what you need to pay attention to when tattooing small designs, check out this video here.